In 1842, inside Ashcombe Manor in England, a boy was discovered who seemed to defy every law of nature. He looked human, but something about him unsettled even the most learned scientists. No one could agree on what he was, and in the end they refused to classify him at all. This is the story of the child who haunted a family, defied science, and became the subject of whispers that have lingered for nearly 2 centuries. A tale where history, superstition, and fear collide in the corridors of a crumbling manor house. Before we begin, subscribe to the Macabre Record and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to see how far these echoes reach. They called it Ashcombe Manor, though by the 1840s its reputation was already tinged with unease. The estate stood on the edge of Somerset countryside, shrouded in creeping ivy and mist that seemed reluctant to lift even on the sunniest mornings. To locals, it was a place best avoided, a grand house fallen into silence, where candlelight burned late into the night, but laughter never carried through the windows. Servants kept their voices low, doors creaked as though resisting their use, and the air always felt heavier than it should. Yet it was within these walls that a child came to live, a child who even then seemed somehow out of place. The earliest descriptions are scattered, tucked away in letters and fading journals. Some say he was discovered wandering the estate's grounds, others whisper he was smuggled in during the night by the lord of the house himself. What is certain is that the boy appeared suddenly, without records, without parentage, and without explanation. He was housed in a corner room on the 2nd floor, the shutters kept drawn, the curtains perpetually closed. Few ever saw him, yet those who did came away with uneasy impressions they struggled to put into words. They said his eyes were too old for his face, his gaze lingering too long, too knowing, as though he were not observing the world, but measuring it. His silences were more disturbing than his words, because in silence he seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. Even in youth, there was an uncanny stillness about him, an absence of the natural restlessness of children. And yet, despite this, no illness could be named, no deformity marked, no madness explained. He was simply other. By the time the first rumours began to drift beyond the manor's iron gates, the people of Ashcombe village were already whispering one chilling question. If he was not like any boy they had known, then what exactly was he? Victorian England was a world caught between 2 great forces, its ancient superstitions and its newfound faith in science. By 1842, the Industrial Revolution had transformed not only the streets of London and Manchester, but also the way men thought about the human body, the mind, and the natural world. Scholars in universities spoke with absolute confidence that everything, every plant, every insect, every skull, every behavior could be measured, catalogued, and explained. They believed that progress meant pulling back the veil on mysteries that had haunted mankind for centuries. This obsession gave rise to the era's strange sciences: phrenology, which claimed to read character from the bumps of the skull, mesmerism, which promised to uncover hidden energies of the mind, and craniometry, where calipers measured intelligence in millimeters. Even medicine itself was shifting from guesswork to anatomy, dissection, and the beginnings of what we would call psychiatry. In short, the Victorian belief was simple. There was no such thing as the inexplicable. With the right classification, the right label, every puzzle could be solved. And yet, into this age of supreme confidence came a boy who resisted every attempt to be defined. The doctors who were summoned to Ashcombe Manor did not know what to make of him. He was not feeble-minded, yet he could not be taught in ordinary ways. He was not mute, yet for long stretches he spoke nothing at all. He was not deformed, yet those who met his gaze felt there was something not entirely human in the way he regarded them. To the villagers, this alone was enough. They still lived in the shadow of older beliefs, where a child who did not act like other children might be called a changeling, a fey substitute left in place of a stolen human infant. To them, it was not science that offered the truest explanation, but folklore, whispered by hearth-fire and passed down for generations. And so, while the scientists sharpened their quills and their theories, the locals shook their heads in fear, convinced that whatever lived inside Ashcombe Manor did not belong among them. It was a paradox fit for the times, a boy who could not be explained by science, and yet one whose very existence rekindled the oldest superstitions. But what unsettled the scientists most was not what they could not understand. It was the quiet suspicion that the boy himself seemed to understand them far better than they understood him. Ashcombe Manor was not merely a house, it was a presence. Rising from the Somerset countryside, its gables and chimneys clawed at the sky like blackened fingers, its windows staring outward with a fixed, vacant expression. By the 1840s, the estate was already falling into quiet decline, the stonework mottled with moss, the gardens gone to ruin. Ivy climbed over the walls as though trying to smother the structure back into the earth, while inside, the scent of damp hung heavy in every corridor. Those who worked there described the manor as always listening, its long hallways carrying whispers farther than any ear should have heard them. The rooms themselves reflected a kind of frozen time. Parlours once filled with music now stood silent, their grand pianos shrouded in dust cloths. Staircases creaked as though each step resisted the weight of trespass. Servants spoke of draughts that came not from broken windows but from closed doors, as if the house itself sighed when no one was near. And though candlelight glowed late into the night, the shadows seemed to linger longer than the flames should have allowed, pooling in corners, crawling across walls. It was into this uneasy stage that the boy appeared. He did not belong to the house, yet somehow he seemed part of its fabric, an addition as natural and as troubling as the ivy strangling its outer walls. When visitors came, they spoke later not of the grand portraits or the tapestries, but of the silence that settled when they crossed the threshold, as though they had stepped into a place where normal rules no longer applied. The manor demanded a kind of reverence, and in its silence one could almost imagine it watching. The villagers in Ashcombe kept their distance. Passing by, they would quicken their steps, whispering prayers beneath their breath. Stories gathered around the house like fog. Tales of lights seen in empty windows, of screams muffled by heavy curtains, of carriages arriving in the night bearing guests who never left. It was said that the family rarely entertained anymore, but when they did, those who attended seemed to change after crossing its gates, their faces drawn, their voices hushed. The manor was a place where secrets could be kept, and it was within its locked and shuttered rooms that one secret above all would defy explanation. The boy who lived there, and the sense that he was not a guest of the house, but its keeper. The first traceable mentions of the boy appear not in official registries, but in the scattered writings of those connected to Ashcombe Manor. A housekeeper's diary from 1842 notes simply, "The new child is quiet, too quiet. He does not cry, and he does not laugh." A groom, writing in a letter to his brother, refers to "a pale little lord in the upper rooms, with eyes too knowing for his years." Yet for all these fragments, nowhere in parish or county records does his name appear. No birth certificate, no baptism, no trace of parentage. This absence is more than curious. In Victorian England, baptism was not merely a religious rite, but a social necessity. Every child, regardless of station, was marked in ink within the parish book. The boy of Ashcombe was not. The omission left a troubling void, as though the world itself had no record of his beginning. Some suspected he was illegitimate, perhaps the hidden child of the master of the house. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he was not born at all, but found. Several accounts suggest his sudden arrival. One story tells of a carriage arriving at the manor in the dead of night, its wheels muffled, its lamps dark. The boy, it is said, was carried inside, wrapped in cloth, his face covered, his form small enough to pass unnoticed. Servants whispered that Lord Ashcombe himself brought him in, though no one dared question the act. Another version claims he was discovered wandering the edge of the estate gardens, half-starved yet oddly unharmed, speaking no words, but meeting each question with a piercing stare that silenced those who asked. Whatever the truth, one fact remained constant. He was never presented to society, never introduced, never explained. Instead, he was kept apart, in a shuttered room overlooking the east lawn. Meals were brought, toys left untouched, tutors summoned only to leave unsettled and shaken. His existence was known only to those who worked behind the manor's heavy doors, and even they spoke of him rarely. What disturbed them most was not his silence, nor his sudden appearance, but the impression, difficult to describe, that he had always been there. As though the manor itself had not welcomed him in, but revealed him, like some hidden room suddenly discovered in the architecture. And then came the question that would never leave Ashcombe village. If he had not been born among them, and if he had no record, no origin, then who or what was he? The earliest witness accounts of the boy's behaviour are filled with unease rather than outright accusation. Servants at Ashcombe recalled moments that seemed small at first, yet lodged in memory like splinters. They said he had a habit of appearing where no one expected him, standing silently in a doorway or at the far end of a hall, watching, his head tilted slightly, as though he were measuring not just the scene, but the people within it. One maid swore she had locked the upstairs corridor at night, only to find him wandering it barefoot in the morning, his eyes wide and alert, though the door bolts remained fastened. It was his mimicry, however, that disturbed them most. The boy seldom spoke, yet when he did, his words often came in voices that were not his own. He would repeat a sentence spoken hours before, matching the exact tone and cadence of the speaker. A butler remembered dropping a glass in the scullery and cursing under his breath, only to hear the same words whispered back to him hours later in his own voice, though the boy had not been present at the time. To some, it seemed no more than a child's game. To others, it felt like mockery, as if he was not learning speech but testing it, rehearsing humanity without ever being part of it. At night, villagers passing the manor claimed they saw a pale figure moving near the windows, pacing long after the household should have been asleep. One shepherd told of seeing the boy in the fields at dawn, walking slowly through the grass, his face turned upward as though he were listening to something in the sky. By the time the shepherd reached him, the boy was gone, leaving no footprints in the dew. What gave these accounts weight was not merely their strangeness, but their consistency. Different people, from servants to neighbours, described the same habits: the watching, the mimicry, the silent wanderings. The impression that built over time was of a child who did not grow naturally into the world, but instead studied it, absorbed it, like an outsider trying to pass for something he was not. And still, the question pressed upon all who encountered him. Was he trying to become more like them, or was he only showing them how little like them he truly was? It was not long before word of the boy reached beyond Ashcombe village. Rumours, after all, have a way of slipping through cracks, and the strangeness of his presence proved too potent to remain confined within the manor's walls. By late 1842, learned men from nearby Bristol and Bath were quietly summoned, their task to determine whether the boy was simply afflicted by some rare disorder or whether, as the more superstitious claimed, he was something else entirely. The first accounts describe examinations that began with confidence. The doctors arrived armed with calipers, notebooks, and the certainty of their age that nothing was beyond the scope of measurement. They recorded the circumference of his head, the angle of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders. They noted that his body bore no deformity, no trace of disease, no obvious defect. His pulse was steady, his reflexes sound, his limbs strong. In appearance, he was simply a boy. And yet, when they turned to his manner, their certainty began to falter. He spoke little, but when prompted, he would answer with sentences so carefully formed, so oddly precise, that they did not sound like the speech of a child, but rather like quotations remembered from another's tongue. Asked to solve simple puzzles, he completed them with speed, but when presented with questions of abstract philosophy, ones a boy of his years could not have comprehended, he responded with uncanny clarity, sometimes with counter-questions that left the examiners unsettled. One physician noted in his journal that when he attempted to take the boy's pulse, the child met his eyes so directly that the doctor felt as if the roles had reversed, as though I were the subject under examination. Another wrote that he left the manor certain he had not studied a patient, but had been observed himself, weighed and measured in some silent, unknowable way. Yet the most troubling detail was not what the doctors discovered, but what they chose to omit. In private letters, they confessed their confusion, admitting that he did not fit within categories of idiocy, lunacy, or genius. But in their official publications, there is silence, no case notes, no reports. It is as though, having encountered something they could not name, they collectively agreed to pretend he had never been examined at all. And so the mystery deepened. Why would men of science, whose reputations depended upon discovery, turn their backs on perhaps the most extraordinary case of their age? As the doctors retreated into silence, the villagers of Ashcombe filled the void with older stories. In the countryside of Somerset, belief in the unseen had never truly faded. Farmers still nailed horseshoes above their thresholds, mothers still whispered charms over cradles, and tales of the Fae still threaded through the hedgerows. When word spread of the strange child at Ashcombe Manor, unbaptized, unrecorded, unexplainable, it was inevitable that superstition would seize upon him. The word most often whispered was changeling. According to the old stories, the Fae would steal a healthy child from its cradle, leaving behind a creature in its place, a pale, watchful thing that looked human, but was not. Changelings were said to be curiously silent or unnervingly clever, to mimic speech without warmth, to sit still for hours as though listening to voices beyond the veil. And when the villagers described the boy at the manor, the likeness was undeniable. One midwife in the village was heard to say that she had once looked upon his face through a half-open carriage door, and what she saw there convinced her he was not born of woman. Others told of mothers clutching their infants closer when they passed the estate gates, fearful that a glance from the manor's shuttered windows might draw the attention of whatever dwelled within. Children, bold in daylight, dared each other to touch the iron gates, claiming the boy's eyes could be felt even through the glass panes and curtains. For the Ashcombe family, these whispers became another burden to bear. Lord Ashcombe dismissed the tales as ignorant peasant talk, yet he kept the boy hidden all the same, as though he too sensed the power of such stories. Lady Ashcombe, more quietly, began making donations to the parish church, commissioning extra masses as though prayers might balance whatever shadow had entered their home. But among the villagers, no priest or doctor could convince them otherwise. To them, the boy was not sick, nor cursed, nor misunderstood. He was not theirs at all. He belonged to another realm, and every day he remained at Ashcombe Manor was a day of danger for all who lived nearby. And so, while science looked away, folklore gave the child a name. Not a boy, but a changeling. Not one of them, but something left in their midst. If there was one feature that unsettled both scientists and villagers alike, it was the boy's silence. For months at a time, he would utter nothing at all. He would sit by the window of his shuttered room, staring into the trees, his hands folded neatly in his lap, as though listening to some distant signal only he could hear. Servants said they often forgot he was there, so still was his body, so absent his presence. At times they swore they could walk past him without realizing until they felt the prickling sensation of being watched, only to turn and see his eyes fixed upon them, calm and unblinking. Yet this muteness was not the muteness of ignorance. When words finally did come, they arrived fully formed, sentences with precision and clarity that startled those who heard them. One maid recounted leaving a book of sermons unattended in the boy's room. Days later, without ever having been taught to read aloud, he repeated passages word for word, mimicking the cadence of the vicar's voice, though he had never heard him preach. Another time, when questioned on a simple arithmetic exercise, he replied not with the answer expected, but with an explanation of Euclid's propositions, delivered in the flat, deliberate tone of a lecturer twice his age. The question that haunted those who heard him was simple. Where did this knowledge come from? He had no tutor beyond a handful of reluctant instructors, each of whom reported leaving more shaken than enlightened. Books were kept from him, locked away for fear he might consume their contents, as he seemed to do with voices and phrases, and yet, time and again, he spoke of things beyond his reach. Astronomical terms, fragments of Latin prayers, snatches of poetry. He never offered them freely. Instead, they slipped out in response to questions no ordinary child should have understood. What disturbed the witnesses most was not just the knowledge itself, but the manner in which he delivered it. There was no pride in his speech, no sense of wonder or curiosity. It was as though he were recalling facts long since memorized, drawing from a reservoir already complete within him. The silences, the sudden outpourings, the inexplicable sources, all of it built toward a picture that unsettled both the scientific mind and the superstitious heart. If he was not learning from the world around him, then where were these words, these ideas, coming from? Within Ashcombe Manor, the boy's presence was both a burden and a bond. Of the family, it was Lady Ashcombe who seemed most attached to him. Servants recalled her frequent visits to the shuttered room on the east side of the house, her soft voice drifting through the door as though soothing a restless infant. She would sit with him for hours, often in silence, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder while he stared into the fire or traced patterns on the wooden floor. Some said she looked upon him as her own, though no one could say why, for he was not born of her body. There was a tenderness in her gaze, but it was tinged with an anxious sorrow, as if she knew her affection was both necessary and dangerous. Lord Ashcombe, by contrast, maintained a distance so sharp it was impossible not to notice. He provided for the boy, meals, clothing, occasional tutors, but he did not linger in his company. When he did enter the room, those present reported a stiffness in his bearing, a reluctance to meet the boy's eyes. One footman claimed to have overheard an argument between master and mistress, the lord insisting the boy must not be shown, while the lady pleaded that he was still theirs in God's sight. Whatever else was said was swallowed by closed doors, but from that day forward Lord Ashcombe was rarely seen near the east wing. Among the servants, speculation festered. Some believed the boy was indeed the illegitimate son of Lord Ashcombe, brought into the house under cover of night. If that were true, however, why keep him hidden rather than raise him openly as kin? Others whispered that Lady Ashcombe had lost a child of her own, and that this strange boy had been taken in to soothe her grief. Yet no record of such a birth or death survives, and the house's parish register contains no such entry. What remained undeniable was the imbalance, a mother's tenderness paired with a father's dread. The boy seemed to sense it too. When Lady Ashcombe entered, his gaze softened, his posture eased. But in the presence of the Lord, he grew motionless, his eyes narrowing as if measuring not a parent but an opponent. And so the manor itself became divided, one half wrapped in maternal protection, the other bound in fearful secrecy. What was it that Lord Ashcombe feared? And why did Lady Ashcombe refuse to turn away? The servants of Ashcombe Manor left behind the most telling accounts of the boy's presence, though most wrote of him only years later, when distance dulled their fear into words. What emerges is not the portrait of a child cared for in the ordinary way, but of a figure who seemed to unsettle the very rhythms of daily life. Meals, for instance, became a point of unease. Trays were left outside his chamber door at regular hours, yet often when the maid returned, the food was untouched. Sometimes it remained exactly as it had been placed, as though not even the steam had stirred, while other times it was found scraped clean with meticulous precision, every crumb gone, though no sound of eating had been heard. One maid swore that she once arrived early and found the plate already empty, though she had not seen the boy pass her in the hall. Locked doors, too, brought confusion. The east wing was sealed each night, the iron keys kept by the steward, yet servants reported finding the boy wandering in corridors at dawn, his bare feet padding over cold stone floors. The locks remained intact, the keys undisturbed. A footman confessed that he began to dread each morning's rounds, uncertain of where he might glimpse the pale figure waiting silently in some shadowed corner. More unsettling still was the impression, difficult to name, that the boy knew them before they knew him. A housemaid described how she once carried linens down the hall, thinking of the song she would sing to herself at her work, when the boy, standing ahead of her, began to hum the tune before she had uttered a note. Another remembered dropping her sewing needle, only to have the boy's hand open to reveal it before she had even bent to the floor to search. These were not grand miracles, but they were enough to shake those who lived closest to him, as though he walked half a step ahead of their thoughts. Such impressions rarely made their way beyond whispers, for who among them could explain such things without sounding mad? Yet the unease grew day by day until the servants themselves began to request transfer to other houses. Their departures were often sudden, their reasons vague, but in every case the common thread was clear. Life at Ashcombe Manor was no longer ordinary, and the boy was at its centre. When the silence of the servants gave way to rumour, Ashcombe Manor once again opened its doors to men of learning, though this time more cautiously than before. The mid-19th century was a fertile age for new sciences, each promising to unlock the hidden workings of the mind and body. Phrenologists arrived first, their calipers gleaming, eager to map the boy's skull and discover in its contours the secrets of his character. They left unsettled. His measurements, they recorded, fit no pattern, neither the smooth lines of genius nor the irregularities of criminality. Instead, they contradicted themselves, as if the very shape of his head refused to confess its meaning. Mesmerists came next, confident that the mysterious energies they claimed to channel could draw forth the boy's inner truth. Yet when they attempted to place him under trance, it was they who faltered. One practitioner confessed in private correspondence that the boy's gaze alone had made him feel as though he were the one under mesmerism, stripped bare before a will stronger than his own. Another refused to speak of the session at all, departing the manor within hours and leaving his instruments behind. Physicians of a more traditional bent attempted to place him within the growing categories of madness and idiocy. They tested his memory, his motor functions, his comprehension. In every case he confounded them. He could recall sequences of numbers well beyond expectation, yet sometimes stared blankly at the simplest of tasks, as if lowering himself into confusion by choice. When asked to define words, he did so with eerie precision. When asked to explain feelings, he offered nothing but silence. A doctor from London summarized it bluntly in his notes. He is not idiot, not lunatic, not prodigy. He is unaccountable. The refusal of these systems to hold him became its own kind of verdict. In an age where classification was the heartbeat of knowledge, here was a child who slipped from every grasp, who broke the rules not through defiance, but through the simple fact of his being. And as the scientists departed one by one, their notebooks grew thinner, their voices quieter, until at last no more were invited to Ashcombe. The boy remained where he was, unlabelled, unstudied, and unanswered. And yet, outside the manor walls, whispers thickened. If science could not explain him, then perhaps the old stories had been right all along. As the years at Ashcombe unfolded, the boy's presence grew more disturbing, not merely in the silence of his room or the strangeness of his speech, but in the way the world around him seemed to bend. Animals, once kept in abundance on the manor grounds, began to avoid the east wing altogether. Horses would shy violently if led too near his chamber windows, stamping and frothing until their handlers dragged them away. Dogs, loyal and steady, tucked their tails when he passed and whined as though struck, refusing to come closer. One shepherd from the village claimed his flock scattered whenever the boy was seen walking along the hedgerows, though no sound or gesture had been made to startle them. Inside the house, mirrors became a source of unease. Servants said he would not look directly into them, and if forced to, his reflection seemed somehow delayed, a fraction of a heartbeat slower than his movements. One maid swore that in the silvered glass of the drawing-room she saw him smiling when his lips in reality remained closed. Whether illusion or truth, it was enough for her to resign her post within the week. From that time forward, many mirrors in the manor were covered or quietly removed. And though Lady Ashcombe made efforts to see him treated as a child, the children of the village refused him instinctively. A tutor once attempted to bring in local boys to provide companionship, but the experiment lasted less than a single afternoon. The children would not sit near him nor play at their games. One was found trembling in the stable afterward, muttering that the boy had looked through him, though he could not say what he meant. Even the rhythms of the house seemed to falter. Fires went out without cause, shutters rattled though no wind touched them, and on more than one occasion food spoiled within a single day of being prepared for his room. Servants began to say that his presence carried a weight, that where he lingered, warmth bled away, laughter faded, and the ordinary pulse of life slowed into something unnatural. These were not dramatic acts, not the violent marvels of folklore. They were smaller, subtler disturbances, yet far more insidious for their persistence. It was as though he existed not merely apart from the household, but against it, each year, pulling the manor further into silence. And then, one evening, silence gave way to violence. The silence that had settled over Ashcombe was broken one winter evening with an incident that shook both the household and the village beyond. The details, as with so much in this story, survive only in fragments, diary notes, half-burned letters, whispers passed down. But in every version, one fact remains constant. Violence erupted within the manor, and the boy was at its centre. It began, according to a chambermaid's testimony years later, with a cry that rang through the east wing, sharp and panicked, unlike anything she had heard in her service. When the servants rushed toward the sound, they found one of the house's tutors sprawled at the bottom of the grand staircase. His face was pale, his breathing ragged, his arm bent unnaturally beneath him. He would survive, but he never returned to Ashcombe, nor did he speak freely of what had transpired. In his later letters, he described only a confrontation with the child and an expression I pray never to see again. Rumour filled the silence left by his reluctance. Some claimed he had struck the boy, frustrated by another day of eerie stillness and refusal to answer. Others insisted he had been pulled, not pushed, his fall guided by no hand that could be seen. The boy himself was found standing quietly at the top of the staircase, his gaze fixed downward, his expression unreadable. He neither cried out nor fled, but simply waited as though the scene were no more unusual than a plate set upon a table. In the aftermath, Lady Ashcombe insisted the matter be hushed. The tutor was dismissed with generous compensation, the servants sworn to silence. Yet the incident spread quickly through the village, carried in whispers that the manor now sheltered something not merely strange, but dangerous. Mothers forbade their children to walk near the gates. Men began crossing themselves when they passed the high stone walls at dusk. The name changeling returned with new force, now spoken not only as a tale, but as a warning. Lord Ashcombe, once merely distant, grew harsh. The east wing was ordered locked at all hours, save when his wife entered with permission. The boy's wanderings were curtailed, his meals delivered with iron formality. But the damage had been done. The household no longer feared only the boy's strangeness. They feared his power. And for the first time the question shifted. Not just what was he, but if he could do such things, what might he do next? After the violent incident, scientific interest in the boy was rekindled, though this time it was cloaked in greater secrecy. Physicians and naturalists were brought quietly to Ashcombe, not in public summons, but in discreet visits, their carriages arriving under the cover of fog or dusk. What they recorded never reached official journals, but fragments survive in private letters and marginal notes, preserved only because they were never meant for public eyes. The most troubling details are small yet consistent. Several observers remarked on the boy's eyes, which they described as slightly larger than proportion, with an iridescence that shifted under candlelight, sometimes appearing grey, sometimes green, sometimes a shade between. One physician wrote that when light struck them, it was not reflected so much as absorbed, leaving him with the disquieting impression of depth rather than surface. His gait was another anomaly. Though steady, it carried an odd rhythm, too measured, too deliberate for a child. One doctor described it as mechanical, another as the careful pacing of a man twice his years. His posture, too, seemed unnatural, his spine straight as though resisting the natural curve of growth. Yet, despite these peculiarities, no defect or disease could be assigned. Most disturbing of all were the proportions of his body. Measurements of his limbs, taken in secret by a physician from Bath, revealed ratios slightly outside normal ranges, not grotesquely so, but enough to unsettle. His arms were a fraction too long, his fingers slender and almost delicate, his head a shade larger than the charts of childhood development prescribed. In isolation, these details might have been dismissed, but together they formed a pattern that resisted explanation. The conclusion, if it can be called one, was silence. The observers wrote of contradictions, of a child too symmetrical in some ways, too irregular in others, whose form could not be reconciled with known human variation. One note survives, written in the margin of a discarded casebook. Not a monstrosity, not a deformity, rather an order we have not seen. Yet none of these details were ever published. Just as with the earlier examinations, the findings evaporated into silence, as though to acknowledge them publicly would risk reputations or perhaps invite questions too dangerous to entertain. And so the records faded, preserved only in whispers, their meaning left to speculation. If the boy's appearance defied science, then perhaps the villagers had been right all along. Perhaps he belonged not to the catalogue of man, but to something outside it. By the mid-1840s, Ashcombe village no longer spoke of the boy in hushed curiosity, but in outright dread. The word changeling had become common on every tongue, but new names began to emerge as well: the pale omen, the ash ghost, the fey child. To the villagers, his presence was no longer a curiosity hidden in the manor, but a shadow that stretched across their own lives. Every misfortune, no matter how ordinary, found its cause at the gates of Ashcombe. When crops failed under an unexpected frost, the blame fell upon the boy. When a cow birthed a stillborn calf, whispers spread that his eyes had been seen glimmering from the manor window the night before. Even sickness, which had long plagued the marshy lowlands, was attributed to his influence. Families began marking their doorways with chalk crosses. Mothers pressed sprigs of rowan into their children's pockets, and the local vicar was besieged with requests for blessings. To the villagers, the science that had failed to name the boy was meaningless. The old stories, however, provided answers, and those answers were dark. Tales grew bolder with each retelling. Some claimed the boy could walk without leaving footprints, others that he spoke in voices not his own, and still others that he did not sleep at all, wandering the manor's halls night after night. A few swore they had seen him at the edge of the village, though the manor servants insisted he had not left the estate in years. These contradictions only added to his legend, for in folklore, impossibility is no obstacle, it is fuel. The family's efforts to contain the rumours failed. Lady Ashcombe's charitable donations to the parish, once accepted with gratitude, were now received with wary reluctance, as though touched by taint. Lord Ashcombe's rare appearances in the village were met with bowed heads and silence. Even the servants who ventured into town found themselves shunned, their presence treated as contamination. By now the boy was no longer viewed simply as different. He was seen as a curse, an ill-omened presence whose very existence threatened the balance of the community. And with every passing year the sense grew stronger that the longer he remained in Ashcombe Manor, the closer disaster drew. And then, in the shadow of this fear, misfortunes began to escalate, until the village no longer whispered of him as a child, but as something far more dangerous. By the late 1840s, the unease that clung to Ashcombe Manor had spread far beyond its stone walls. The village, once merely wary, now simmered with suspicion, and each season seemed to bring fresh misfortune to stoke the flames. A storm tore through the valley one spring, flattening crops and flooding barns, and many swore it was no act of God, but the shadow of the boy within the manor. That winter, when a fever took 3 children from the same lane, the whispers hardened into conviction. Ashcombe housed a curse, and it walked in the form of a child. The family, already withdrawn, became near prisoners in their own estate. Carriages were vandalized when they attempted to travel to market. One was found overturned in a ditch, its wheels hacked apart as if by axes. Servants sent on errands returned shaken, reporting hostile stares and muttered threats. The manor gates, once ornamental, were now kept chained, not for protection from thieves, but from their own neighbours. Within the house, the atmosphere grew heavier still. Fires were kept burning at all hours, shutters drawn tight, as though heat and darkness together could bar out the judgment of the world beyond. Yet even inside, the servants whispered that the boy's presence was changing the very feel of the place. The air seemed colder, they said, and the walls more damp, though the hearth blazed and the roof was sound. One footman swore that each time he carried a tray up the east staircase, his breath fogged as if he were outdoors in midwinter. It was not long before talk of expulsion reached the parish. Villagers pressed the vicar to intervene, to demand that the Ashcombe family send the boy away, perhaps to an asylum or some distant school. But the family resisted, Lady Ashcombe most fiercely, declaring that no such act would be done to one entrusted to our care. Her words might have been noble, but they only inflamed suspicion. If she would protect him so fiercely, the villagers reasoned, then perhaps she was bound to him not by duty, but by pact. The manor stood now as a fortress of dread, isolated and mistrusted. Every misfortune became its fault, every shadow its omen. And while the villagers' fear mounted outside its gates, those who lived within began to ask themselves a question they dared not utter aloud. Was the danger truly imagined, or was there something within the east wing that justified every whisper? Even as the villagers branded him a curse, those within the manor witnessed something more unsettling than silence or mimicry. The boy began to display knowledge that could not be accounted for by his years, his upbringing, or the limits of his world. It began innocuously enough, a scrap of Latin recited while Lady Ashcombe read from her prayer book. She was startled, for she had not spoken the words aloud, yet the boy repeated them with flawless pronunciation, his voice flat and precise. From there, the incidents multiplied. A tutor brought in from Bath attempted to test him with basic lessons, only to find himself corrected in his own Greek declensions. Another, a mathematics instructor, recorded that the boy solved problems in Euclidean geometry without hesitation. But when pressed for how he knew the solutions, he simply stared in silence, as if the question itself were meaningless. On one occasion, the boy drew with chalk upon the floor what appeared to be a diagram of the solar system, not as it was depicted in the almanacs of the day, but in a form closer to modern astronomical models, complete with elliptical orbits. None could explain where such knowledge had been gleaned. It was not only intellectual matters. A footman described carrying a French merchant's letter into the house and, before it was opened, hearing the boy murmur a translation of its contents. He had never been taught the language. Another servant swore he once heard the child humming an Irish ballad sung only in taverns, though the boy had never left the manor grounds, and no such song had been performed in his hearing. What disturbed observers most was not merely the knowledge itself, but its delivery. The boy offered it with no pride, no childlike joy at discovery. Instead, it came as though recalled from a place within him, already complete, already known. When asked how he had learned, he gave no answer. When pressed, he withdrew into silence. Some whispered he was a savant, touched by some rare condition beyond medicine's reach. Others whispered darker still, that he was a vessel, a mouth through which other voices spoke. For Lady Ashcombe, it was proof that he was extraordinary. For Lord Ashcombe, it was the final confirmation that his presence was not natural. And so the boy's knowledge, instead of redeeming him, deepened the divide. Was he gifted, or was he simply revealing knowledge not meant to be in human hands? The Ashcombe family, unwilling to surrender entirely to rumour, still made efforts to educate the boy. If his knowledge was uncanny, they reasoned, perhaps it could be shaped, disciplined, made useful. Tutors were engaged, each arriving with optimism, each leaving in silence. What happened in those lessons survives only in fragments, yet the pattern is unmistakable. Every teacher who entered the East Wing emerged changed. One mathematics tutor, a stern man of middle years, wrote in his journal that the boy not only mastered the problems set before him, but then inverted them, posing new variations the tutor himself could not solve. When pressed for explanation, the child merely tilted his head and asked, "Is the question the answer, or the answer the question?" The tutor dismissed it as nonsense at first, but found himself unable to banish the words from his thoughts, turning them over restlessly at night, until at last he begged release from his employment. A language scholar fared no better. Hoping to impress his pupil, he read aloud a passage in Old Church Slavonic, confident the boy could not respond. The child repeated the text flawlessly, then asked for another tongue. By the end of the lesson, he had echoed fragments in 3 languages he had never studied, his voice coldly precise, as though dredging memory rather than learning anew. The scholar's notes trembled as he wrote, "I cannot teach one who already knows." He departed before the week was out. Even those who sought to appeal to gentler arts recoiled. A music instructor claimed the boy could pick out melodies after hearing them only once, but when asked to create his own, he produced a tune so discordant, so strangely weighted with unfamiliar intervals, that the man stopped him at once, declaring it inhuman. He never returned. Each tutor carried away not only failure, but unease, as though they had been the ones examined, tested, and found lacking. They described the same gaze, cool and unwavering, that made them feel like subjects under a lens. None of them spoke publicly of their time at Ashcombe. Their silence joined the growing shadow of the boy's mystery. The hope that education might normalize him withered quickly. Instead, it left behind the unsettling impression that the boy was not learning at all but unveiling, peeling back some curtain between his mind and theirs, and beneath it all lingered a more frightening thought. If he was the pupil, why did every teacher leave convinced they had been the one taught? As the boy advanced in years, those who remained in Ashcombe began to notice that his growth did not follow the natural pattern of childhood. At first, it was dismissed. Children develop at different rates, some quickly, some slowly. But with him, the changes were not merely uneven, they were uncanny. By accounts, he grew taller than expected, yet the increase came in sudden bursts, not gradual progression. Servants described how they would leave him 1 month slight and narrow, only to return weeks later to find his limbs lengthened, his clothes hanging ill-fitting, as though he had leapt forward in time while the rest of the household slept. His hands, too, drew attention, long and fine, the fingers extending further than seemed proportionate, their reach almost delicate, yet lending him a grace that was neither boyish nor manly, but something between. Most disquieting was the manner in which his face seemed to shift. He bore the features of a child, yet at moments, under certain light, there appeared the suggestion of age, as though his eyes and expression belonged to someone far older, someone who had already lived and seen. A housemaid claimed she once caught sight of him at dawn, his reflection in a rain-darkened window, and for an instant thought she saw not a boy, but a man staring back, only for the vision to vanish when she blinked. Others whispered that his voice deepened too soon, carrying a resonance out of keeping with his slight frame. Yet just as suddenly, it would lift again into a higher register, as though undecided to which age it belonged. He was neither wholly child nor wholly youth, caught in a liminal state that unsettled all who heard him speak. Perhaps most troubling was the sense that these changes were not random, but deliberate, guided by some rhythm known only to him. He never commented upon his shifting form, never betrayed confusion or pride. Instead, he seemed almost expectant, as though each transformation were merely a step toward a shape already known to him, a shape he was destined to reach. And so the whispers deepened. If he did not grow as other boys did, perhaps it was because he was not truly a boy at all. Perhaps he was only wearing the shape of one, an imitation, stretched and altered with each passing year. By the early 1850s, the whispers around Ashcombe Manor had grown too loud to be ignored. Parish gossip had long branded the boy unnatural, but now scattered reports from physicians and tutors began to trouble the authorities. Though never acknowledged in official minutes, there are indications that discreet inquiries were made, not by local constables, but by men sent from London, figures described only as government representatives in the fragments that survive. They did not arrive openly. Villagers recalled strangers passing through the town, educated men who spoke little and asked much. Some claimed to have seen them at the gates of Ashcombe, admitted by Lord Ashcombe himself. What passed within the house is uncertain, but afterward the family's behaviour changed. The lord grew more guarded than ever, his rare trips to the village ceasing altogether. Lady Ashcombe, once pale but composed, began to look drawn and exhausted, as though the burden of secrecy had become unbearable. The boy himself seemed to vanish from sight. Servants who had once spoken reluctantly of his strange habits now said nothing at all, or claimed he had been sent away to study in Bath or to a school across the Channel. Yet no record of his enrollment exists in any institution. Parish registers, which once ignored his birth, now ignored his departure as well. It was as though the boy had been erased, not only from the manor, but from the world beyond its gates. What few clues remain lie in the archives of a defunct medical society in Bristol. Among their scattered papers is a reference to a specimen observed at Ashcombe, 1851, described as beyond present classification, and marked for further observation under restricted circumstances. The note is unsigned, the page torn, as though deliberately mutilated. But it hints at something extraordinary, that the boy was not merely left in the manor to languish, but taken under the eye of authorities who wished to conceal him. For the villagers, his disappearance solved nothing. If anything, it confirmed their darkest suspicions. A child spirited away under secrecy, his existence denied, his strangeness swallowed by government silence. Was this not proof that he had been more than human? If even men of law and science would not speak his name, then surely he belonged to something far older, far darker. From that moment onward, the boy of Ashcombe Manor passed out of sight. Whether he lived, whether he died, whether he became something else entirely, no one could say. In the years that followed the boy's disappearance, Ashcombe Manor began to wither. Whether by coincidence or curse, the family's fortunes dwindled in a pattern too sharp for the villagers to ignore. Crops on their lands faltered, lawsuits drained their coffers, and by the mid-1850s, whispers of debt clung to Lord Ashcombe's name. The once proud house that had stood for centuries now seemed hollow, its fires dim, its windows shuttered more often than lit. Servants, already scarce, began to leave in earnest, their places unfilled. Lady Ashcombe, who had once walked with quiet dignity, grew pale and withdrawn. Some said she spent hours in the east wing, even after it had been locked and sealed, standing in the empty chamber where the boy had once kept his long vigils by the window. She never spoke of him again, yet her sorrow seemed bound to that room, as if some part of her refused to believe he was gone. Neighbours who glimpsed her at rare intervals noted a haunted look in her eyes, as though she carried a secret too heavy for mortal shoulders. Lord Ashcombe, for his part, withdrew from all public life. Once a man of authority in county affairs, he ceased attending parish meetings, court functions, and even the hunting gatherings that had long been his pride. It was said he aged swiftly, his hair whitening within a single season, his shoulders stooped. When he died in 1857, the village murmured it was not illness that took him, but the weight of what he had harboured under his roof. After his death, the family line fractured. Estates were sold, debts settled piecemeal, and Ashcombe Manor itself was left largely abandoned. By the 1860s it stood empty, its gardens choked with weeds, its windows staring like blind eyes into the valley. To the villagers it was no ordinary decline. They said the house had been marked, poisoned by the unnatural child it once sheltered. Some claimed to hear footsteps in its halls long after the doors were locked. Others swore they saw a pale figure at the windows, though no one had lived there for years. Ashcombe was no longer merely a manor. It had become a monument to secrecy, ruin, and the unexplainable. A place where something unclassifiable had dwelt, and where the earth itself seemed unwilling to let that memory fade. When researchers in later years tried to uncover the truth of the Ashcombe case, they encountered an obstacle more formidable than superstition: silence. Parish archives that should have contained birth, baptism, or burial entries for the period were incomplete, entire pages torn or blackened by fire. Correspondence from physicians who were known to have visited the manor was missing from family collections, as though carefully removed. Even estate ledgers, which routinely listed expenses for food, staff, and education, contained curious blanks, lines ruled but never filled, months where ink was absent altogether. It was as if the boy's presence had been not only hidden in life, but systematically erased in death. One antiquarian who attempted to document the matter in the 1880s reported that several sources had warned him away. A retired servant, once willing to speak, suddenly refused, saying only, "I have said too much already." Another researcher discovered that a sheaf of letters from a Bristol physician had been burned by his descendants, with a note explaining that the contents were unfit for Christian eyes. A few tantalizing fragments survive, references to a case most irregular, beyond measure troubling, and a matter the authorities themselves prefer sealed. The most telling evidence lies in absence. Medical journals of the 1840s and 1850s, usually eager to print curious cases, show no mention of Ashcombe, despite private letters confirming at least 3 doctors examined the boy. Government records contain no trace of the so-called representatives rumoured to have visited, yet their presence is corroborated in village diaries. It is as if officialdom had drawn a curtain, allowing gossip to run rampant while ensuring no official word would ever confirm or deny the tale. Why such careful omission? One theory suggests embarrassment, that the finest minds of the age encountered something they could not explain and chose to bury the failure rather than admit defeat. Another, darker possibility is that they discovered more than they wished to share, that the boy represented something so troubling, so disruptive to the categories of science, that silence was the only defense. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The boy of Ashcombe Manor slipped into the margins of history, spoken of only in rumour and fragment, denied the permanence of ink. It was less an act of forgetting than of deliberate burial, a refusal to let his existence stand unchallenged in the record of man. With the records gone or destroyed, the story of the boy did not vanish. It simply changed shape. Where ink and paper failed, word of mouth took over, and in the mouths of villagers, the strange child of Ashcombe Manor became something more than human history. He became folklore. By the late 19th century, when travellers passed through Somerset, they were told not of a boy, but of a ghost. Some said his pale figure could still be seen at the windows of the abandoned manor, staring out as though waiting for someone to return. Others claimed that at night the faint sound of footsteps echoed along the gravel drive, though no visitor ever came. Children whispered dares to approach the gates, daring one another to call his name. The bravest reported that if they lingered, they felt eyes upon them, cold and steady, as though the boy still stood within the shuttered halls. Stories multiplied. He was said to walk without sound, to appear in fields on moonlit nights, or to be glimpsed standing at the edge of the marsh, his reflection rippling on the black water, though the ground beneath him remained dry. Mothers frightened their children with warnings that if they strayed too near the manor, the changeling boy would call them to follow, and they would never be seen again. By the turn of the 20th century, the tale had grown into a full legend. Local folklorists recorded variations. In some, he was an immortal fey child abandoned on earth. In others, he was a restless ghost bound to the place of his unholy origin. A few claimed he was neither boy nor spirit, but an omen, that his appearance foretold death or disaster for any who crossed his path. The details shifted with every telling, but one thing remained constant. He was never remembered as a child like any other. The ruins of Ashcombe Manor, already crumbling by then, only fed the myth. Ivy-choked walls and broken windows seemed to confirm that something unnatural had poisoned the house. Travellers avoided the road, and locals crossed themselves when they passed the overgrown gates. In the absence of truth, legend had claimed its place. The boy of Ashcombe was no longer flesh and blood. He was a haunting, an unquiet presence, condemned to linger where neither science nor scripture had dared to name him. In the 20th and 21st centuries, as folklore hardened into legend, a new kind of curiosity emerged. Historians, psychologists, and paranormal researchers alike tried to peel back the layers of myth to uncover what might have lain at the heart of the Ashcombe story. Their conclusions were as varied as they were inconclusive.
Some medical historians have suggested the boy may have suffered from a rare genetic disorder, Marfan syndrome perhaps, to account for his long limbs and unusual proportions, or a form of gigantism that caused his irregular spurts of growth. His uncanny intelligence, they argue, might have been an example of savant syndrome, cases of which were first being documented in the 19th century. The silence, the mimicry, the bursts of impossible knowledge, these, they claim, could point to an undiagnosed condition on the autism spectrum. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the breadth of the accounts, nor the persistent fear he inspired even in hardened adults. Others have approached the story from a psychological angle, proposing that the legend grew from the villagers' anxieties rather than the boy himself. In an era of upheaval, when science was rewriting the old order, perhaps the child became a vessel for collective unease, a scapegoat upon whom superstition and rumor fastened until he became monstrous in memory. Under this reading, he may have been nothing more than a peculiar but human boy, magnified into myth by fear. Paranormal researchers, however, reject such reductions. To them, the patterns are too strange, the silences too deliberate, the knowledge too unaccountable. They point to the vanished records, the hushed examinations, and the boy's abrupt disappearance as signs of deliberate suppression. Some claim he was not human at all, but a fey child left behind, a folkloric changeling whose story bled into reality. Others push further still, suggesting he was an early encounter of another kind altogether, an intelligence not of this world, misunderstood by a century unprepared to face it. In recent years, the story has even attracted those fascinated by the intersections of folklore and the extraterrestrial. They note the boy's strange eyes, his mimicry, his absorption of knowledge without instruction, and see not a medical anomaly, but a visitor, studying, learning, hiding within human form. And yet, for all the speculation, one truth remains. No theory, no diagnosis, no myth explains him completely. The boy of Ashcombe remains as unclassifiable now as he was in 1842. For historians, the story of the Ashcombe boy is less a puzzle to be solved than a labyrinth of contradictions. Each path seems to lead to a dead end, or worse, a silence that suggests someone long ago intended it to be so. Parish records that should have noted his presence do not. Medical journals that might have contained case studies of his examinations are blank of reference. Private letters speak of him obliquely, then suddenly cut off, as though the pen faltered before daring to say too much. The very pattern of evidence seems almost intentional, enough fragments to fuel rumor, but never enough to form certainty. The contradictions only deepen the confusion. Some accounts describe the boy as frail, others as strong. Some insist he never spoke, others that he spoke with the voice of an adult. One tutor swore he was brilliant, another that he was empty of comprehension, until he suddenly was not. Even the question of his disappearance is fractured. A few sources imply he was taken by the authorities, while others insist he simply wasted away in the East Wing, his body buried without record. And then there are the most unsettling versions, that he never died at all, but simply left, walking one day from the manor and vanishing into the fields beyond. For scholars, these contradictions pose an impossible choice. To treat the boy as legend alone risks discarding testimonies that, though strange, bear the ring of sincerity. Yet to treat him as historical fact requires grappling with phenomena that resist every category, every framework. The more one studies him, the more he seems to slip into the same unclassifiable space where science abandoned him more than a century ago. What unsettles modern researchers most is not the strangeness of the reports, but the consistency of the silence. Across decades, across professions, voices trail off where his name should appear. Documents vanish where his presence might have been confirmed. It is as though history itself recoiled from him, refusing to bear the weight of his existence.
And so the Ashcombe boy remains a riddle not of presence, but of absence, defined less by what we know than by what we cannot prove, by what others would not or dared not write. In that silence, the story lingers like a ghost, whispering the same question that haunted the manor in 1842. Was he ever truly one of us? Looking back, the tragedy of the Ashcombe boy is not only that he was strange, but that no framework of his time could contain him. Science, armed with calipers, phrenology charts, and the growing disciplines of psychiatry, sought to measure and label him, but faltered. He did not fit the categories of idiot, genius, or lunatic. his body, his mind, his behavior, all slipped between definitions, mocking the confidence of an age obsessed with classification. For men who prided themselves on rational order, the refusal to classify him was not just a failure, it was a wound to their certainty. And so they chose silence. Superstition, on the other hand, was eager to claim him. The villagers, steeped in old tales of changelings and fae, saw in him confirmation of their fears. His silence, his mimicry, his uncanny knowledge, these were the traits of something otherworldly. Where science hesitated, folklore named him swiftly. But this too was a failure, for the label of changeling explained nothing. It condemned him without understanding, reduced him to an omen rather than a child. Between these poles, rational science and fearful superstition, the boy was trapped. One refused to acknowledge him, the other misnamed him. Neither saw him clearly. Perhaps that is why his story lingers, not because of what he was, but because of what he revealed about those who tried to understand him. He showed the limits of knowledge, the persistence of fear, and the fragility of certainty in both science and belief. And yet, perhaps the greatest unease comes from the fact that ambiguity has survived untouched. Centuries later, with all our advances, no explanation satisfies. Medical theories can account for fragments, his growth, his silences, his mimicry, but not all together. Folklore offers archetypes, but they explain nothing beyond fear. Paranormal speculation fills the void, but only raises darker questions. The boy science refused to classify remains unclassified still. His story endures not because of what was solved, but because of what was not. In a world where every phenomenon is expected to yield to analysis, here is one that resists. A child who stood between categories, between explanations, and forced those who encountered him to confront the possibility that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Perhaps that is his legacy, not knowledge, not certainty, but the enduring reminder that there are still corners of the human story where the light does not reach, where silence speaks louder than explanation. Today, Ashcombe Manor stands only in fragments, its stones scattered, its halls long since collapsed into ivy and soil. The land has been parcelled and sold, its history reduced to a line or two in county records. And yet, in the minds of those who seek out the strange and the forgotten, the boy remains. He has become less a figure of flesh and bone and more a shadow cast across centuries, a reminder of how little we truly understand about ourselves. Legends say his ghost still lingers, pale at the window or pacing the ruins on misty nights. Folklorists argue over whether he was ever real at all, or merely a tale grown monstrous in the retelling. Historians, piecing together scraps, concede only this: there was a child, there were witnesses, and there was silence where record should have been. Beyond that, nothing is certain, and perhaps that is what makes his story so enduring. The Ashcombe boy unsettles us because he resists every attempt to be pinned down. To the villagers, he was a changeling, an omen of ruin. To scientists, he was a specimen that defied their proud taxonomies. To later generations, he is a ghost, a puzzle, a case study, a warning. But to all, he is something more troubling, a reminder that our systems, whether of science, faith, or folklore, are fragile things, and that when faced with the inexplicable, we often choose silence or myth rather than truth, and so we are left with absence. No grave to mark, no record to consult, no diagnosis to settle the matter. Only fragments, letters, whispers, ruined walls, and a legacy of fear. The boy who appeared without a name and left without explanation continues to live, not in the flesh, but in the questions he left behind. In the end, what was he? A sick child, misunderstood and mistreated. A prodigy whose brilliance unsettled those too narrow to accept it. A legend born of superstition, or something that truly stood outside the natural order. We cannot say. We can only circle the mystery as those before us did, and feel the same unease they must have felt in his presence. The boy science refused to classify remains unclassified, and perhaps that is the only truth he will ever give us.